So we are in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, verse 33. We have been talking about these examples of those individuals who provided faith, or used faith, rather, their faith in God and trust. And we have mentioned Gideon and Barak and Jephthah. And yes, we could have spent a lot more time talking about these individuals. We could learn more and more. Their lives are very interesting in all points. And what we did learn is that these individuals are mentioned in this chapter of the faithful, but yet we note that they were not perfect. They were not sinlessly perfect. They, in their life, demonstrated faith when it was necessary and when it's needed. And that gives you and me today a hope that God doesn't expect us to be sinlessly perfect. And in fact, we note and from time to time observe that from the text of 1 John 1, 6 through 10, that walking in the light as he is in the light doesn't mean to have sinless perfection. And that background of that text in 1 John 1 deals with the idea of Gnosticism, because during the teaching of the day of the Gnostics that were trying to infiltrate and did many ways infiltrate the church was the concept of dualism. And what that is that all material things are evil and all spiritual things were good. So the basis of that particular idea went completely against Christianity, because Jesus Christ, obviously God is a spirit, and being a spiritual being, known as the Word, came into the flesh, physical. So that was, Gnosticism made that impossible. So we know that that was not right. But the Gnostic also had the idea that no matter what he or she did with his body, it did not affect his spirit or her spirit. And so in 1 John 1, 8, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us, is what that means. And same thing in verse 10. We make God a liar if we say we have no sin. In modern day, you would see people who would believe in once saved, always saved. That Calvinistic belief that no matter how much I sin, I can't lose my salvation. So that would be an application of that particular error that we see today. There's nothing new under the sun, is there? So that said, where I'm going is that for you and me, we find comfort in that people that are not 100% perfect are mentioned in the chapter of the faithful. We know that David committed sin. It's mentioned often because of his sin with Bathsheba. As a person after God's own heart, grew in such a way as to commit that through spiritual blindness. But yet, David also corrected his way and dealt with the consequences with the right attitude that was given to him. In verse 33 is where we're going now. This wonderful passage, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of aliens. What you're seeing here is the power of faith, the effectiveness of faith. As you look at this, and we see what's going on today in today's society, it is sometimes a feeling of helplessness, as it seems like the country in which we live, our society, seems to be burning down all around us. And let's understand that that's not without design. We are in a spiritual battle, Ephesians 6:12. We wrestle not with flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Ephesians 6:12 teaches that. In fact, as we're talking about the power of faith, we know the shield of faith is mentioned in Ephesians 6 as a part of the armor of God. And we feel that the effectiveness of good does not seem to triumph. And if you were to place yourself into the eyes or in the place of those in the first century reading this, the army of God was not like it was in the days of the Jews, when the nation of Israel was a physically warring army. We know that in the days of the kings. And so the army of God today is not that. It does the opposite of what the world would think is right. As you go to 1 Corinthians 2, 1 Corinthians 1, I should say, I have such a great appreciation for what is said here. Verse 18 and following, for the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness. For it is, unto us which are saved, it is the power of God, oftentimes quoted with Romans 1:16. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Ooh, great question. The wise of today's world has led us to confusion even about gender. They consider that brilliant. Isn't that just phenomenal? That's the wise. Where is the wise? Something to ponder. Where is the scribe? Now remember, Corinth is in the middle of academia. Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? By all means he has. The truth, as it stands side by side against the mealy-mouthed ways of the world, yes. For after the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It was God's plan to not use the ways of the world to conquer the world. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching, foolish the way they see it, to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. So going back to Hebrews 11, the idea of faith conquering, faith empowering. Those who would read this chapter in the first century would say, you know what, I am not powerless, even though they're bringing down persecution upon me. Even though they're taking away what I own. You see, who through faith subdued kingdoms. It was faith that did that. When God said through Moses, Fear not, stand still, and see the salvation of the Lord. Egypt and Pharaoh was destroyed. Now, not all of Egypt, of course. Wrought righteousness. You can't do it without faith. Obtained promises. Now, a great example to me is Ahaz, King Ahaz. Over in Isaiah 7. And that particular occurrence of this prophet is telling of an event about how that the kingdom of Judah was going to be surrounded or plotted against. In Isaiah 7, verse 3, the Lord said unto Isaiah, Go forth now to meet Ahaz, thou and Shear-Jashub, thy son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool of the highway in the fuller's field. So there's direction that God is giving him. Say unto him, Take heed, be quiet, fear not, neither be faint-hearted for the two tails of these smoking firebrands. It goes on to say about these that are going to attempt to take over God's people. Verse 10, Moreover, the Lord spake again unto Ahaz, saying, Ask thee a sign of the Lord thy God. Ask it either in the depth or the height above. Ask me to prove it to you, that this is not going to happen. Verse 13, of course, Ahab doesn't want to do this. And he said, I don't want to tempt the Lord. He said, Hear ye now, house of David, it is a small thing for you to weary men, but will ye weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. What that meant, God's people aren't going to be destroyed. We are far from hopeless. Daniel 2:44. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall not be destroyed. And the kingdoms shall not be left to other people. Which is important, of course. The sign was that the Messiah was coming to King Ahaz, and God's people was not destroyed. That was the sign. Because God intended purpose was through the Jews to bring the Messiah. So, that was the sign that was given. Going back to Hebrews, obtain promises. Stop the mouths of lions. Of course, we know they would have loved to have heard that in the first century as they were dealing with being persecuted and how that they were made sport many times. We know especially later on because the Roman persecution was local in the days of Nero because of Nero using Christianity as a superstitious tool. That is, through Nero's own superstition and the peoples of the Roman Empire's superstition against Christianity. They blamed Christians for everything that would happen that went wrong. And of course, the fires that would take place, kind of like a little bit of Maui situation, want to improve real estate, just burn all of the ghettos and blame Christians. That's what happened. And so you had a persecution. And of course, many other or several other emperors would do that is to curb the growth of Christianity. They would bring them out into arenas and have them to face gladiators and things that were just appalling. And it causes us to reflect as how much does our God mean to us? Would we endure the same? And as we would see, that they did in the first century. How much was the church affected by COVID-19? How much was it? How many doors were closed? There's a man who visited from Cookeville, Tennessee, where the church is strong up there. And he was one who worked for UPS, and he said it was amazing how many congregations had closed the doors and did not reopen them. You know what? These people didn't have to go through COVID-19. Maybe that would have been different. I mean, facing lions versus COVID-19, they didn't know what they were missing, did they? Of course, I say that tongue-in-cheek. A tad bit of sarcasm there. But you would have thought that it was the same thing upon the Lord's church today. They assembled in the fear. They were still called to assemble, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. For the sake of worshiping God. Yep. Good thing they didn't have to go through COVID. It's a sad thing, though, isn't it? Causes us to think about what are we really willing to sacrifice for God. As it says, stop the mouths of lions. Of course, we know who that would be. That would be Daniel. And of course, not just Daniel, but, well, the one biblical account we have in Daniel 6 is of him having the faith because despite the fact being told not to pray, did. And as Daniel was a great prophet of faith, no doubt about that. It just Daniel, like Isaiah and others of the prophets, Jeremiah, one of my favorite. I love reading Jeremiah. There's just so many great things about these prophets as they applied the law. That's what, the prophets did, applied the law. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? That was the one we know that withstood the fire. And in fact, it says right here, verse 34, quench the violence of fire. And let me just turn to Daniel 3 and appreciate a statement. It reminds me of Job 13:15. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. That's what Job said about God after going through all of that. And in Ananias, Azariah, and Mishael, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were in front of Nebuchadnezzar. And let me find the particular passage where they make a profound statement. And Shadrach, verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. I mean, imagine being there in front of this whited fire that was so hot that it burned those who would come close to it. He will deliver us out of thine hand. But verse 18. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. They had the faith that we know that our God can deliver us, but if not, we're still not bowing down. That overcoming the fear is what that is. And that takes in a tremendous amount of faith or trust in God. To actually endure persecution requires faith. No one suffers for something that they don't believe in. Escape the edge of the sword reminds us of David and King Saul. As it says right here, out of weakness we're made strong, wax valiant in fight. We know David would not want to, as he would say, go against the king's anointed. Even though David was appointed and anointed as to be the king, he did not usurp the authority of King Saul. The Lord's way of doing battle is different than the way of the world, obviously. Machiavelli, someone who wrote The Prince, his idea was that weakness does not allow victory. Rather, you have to be pragmatic and very subtle to gain power and to be very violent through subtle means. We see it in politics all the time. We see how power works. We see how people who assume power today do through subtlety. And he even said that Christ was a great example of weakness. He was good, but yet wound up being crucified. He kind of forgot the rest of the story, by the way. Our Lord willingly went to the cross. He could have called 12 legions of angels. And the last time I checked, he sits and rules over everybody as the King of Kings, the potentate. Yeah, Machiavelli got it wrong. It wasn't weakness, it was strength, a choice, a willingness to do it God's way. If we're going to win the battle, I've said before, we're going to have to do it on God's terms, just like they had to in the days of Jericho and the defeat of that city. The conquering that takes place through Christianity is never by the ways of the world. As it says here, just over in James, one book over, I should say. Verse 19. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. You think there's a little bit of wisdom there? I think so. For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. Verse 20. Out of weakness we're made strong. How many times did God say about the Israelites that they were small on purpose in terms of the world's armies, so that it would be known that it is God who made the victory possible? And it's the same way with the Lord's church today, the army of God. And I know those who do not have faith or who laugh at the idea of faith, they think, oh, what a joke. Who's got the numbers? Well, the devil does, by the way. And that's just not going to happen. There's not going to be a victory for them. And he has deceived them into believing the things of the world is the way to have happiness, the way to have peace. The ways of the world you find happiness. You can be happy having everything that this life has to offer. But it doesn't work that way, does it? Those who have everything, this world is their oyster, they're not happy. Physical things are not designed by God to give us a lasting happiness. But they believe that. So, we understand doing things God's way is what's going to bring about victory in every way, shape, and form. True victory. It's not just me personally. But Christianity, if it is practiced in society, does bring about the good for everybody. That's why God sent His Son to do good to man. That's why God had goodwill toward man. Doing good even to your enemies brings about the result of a peace that passeth all understanding. That's not the ways of the world. But it takes for us to understand how God has victory is through His ways. And for us to trust Him, that's what has to happen. They were made strong, and they turned the flight of the armies of aliens, or the foreigners. In this case, brings to mind Jonathan. Jonathan was a dear friend of David, no doubt about that. In 1 Samuel 14, you see Jonathan's faith in God against the uncircumcised Philistines, as he demonstrated greater faith than his father, King Saul. He and his armor bearer said, we will know if this is God has given us the victory. And sure enough, they went up there and wiped out the garrison and put them to flight. What did that take? But trust and faith in God. They didn't win that battle just because they were great, strong, effective warriors by themselves. And anything that we do is because God is helping us. That's why He deserves the glory, right? Anything we conquer in this life is because God has helped us to do so. But He is showing once again the effectiveness and the power of faith is that kingdoms were subdued. Mouths of lions were stopped. And through the perception of weakness, they were strong. Women received their dead raised from life again. Of course, that's 1 Kings 17. She had gave her very last meal, we know. And God made more. And she was told in the one account of resurrection, I believe it's the only account in the Old Testament, isn't it, Joel? Of resurrection, the dead was raised, and it was a unique way that it was done, I would say, in 1 Kings with Elijah. But it took faith on her part as well. It wasn't the son's faith, was it? The son was dead. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance. In the intertestament period, you had this going on. You had those who would, as Daniel was prophesying about this particular era, where you would have the Jews being persecuted by the Seleucid kings from the south. That was the north, wasn't it, Joel? The Seleucid was from the north. You had them, and they were in the middle between the Seleucids and the what's the one on the south? Ptolemies. Thank you. The Ptolemaic kings, where they would come in there, and you had Antiochus Epiphanes, the madman, referred to as he would come in there and torture God's people, make them wear things around their neck, and remove the law out of the land, and throw pig's blood upon the altar, calling, as Daniel would say, the abomination of desolation. They endured this. You had the Maccabean Wars that you would read about, and how that the Maccabees, that particular family, had great victory over those people.
All of the examples that we have in the scriptures, regardless of where you read about it, when those die, and the Spirit leaves their body, he goes to peace. Everybody's at peace that are in Christ. Every one of us that look forward to death will receive peace. We've got Luke 16 that gives us that. The angels took him there, but he didn't have Jesus with him. Jesus ascended unto the Father. That's where he is now. He is not in paradise. So we have to be careful whenever we say that Jesus is in paradise. He's not. He's in heaven. He awaits. He will come again. What First Thessalonians
4.
Chapter
4:13.
We've got verses 15 through 16, 17, 18, 18. It talks about when the trumpet sound, you shall come again, blah, 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 blah. So we know, but the main point is, if we've been baptized in Christ, we put on Christ. He takes care of us. He has the angels come and take our heart and soul and deliver us to paradise, just like he did for Lazarus.
Right.
But then the rich man,
On the other side.
just the opposite.
Right. Yes, and so it's a very comforting thought to have that in mind, is that we have that to look forward to. But we have to remember to always be thinking about that daily, all the time, is that we are nothing more than strangers and pilgrims, 1 Peter 2:11, and other passages like that. Yes, that's a wonderful, comforting thought, that we will have that peace once, that this life is over for us, this life here.
So just think about all the people, regardless of which dispensation that they live in, that they serve God faithfully, their rest, their peace.
Yes, and as we also learn from the Scriptures, one of the great things about the Bible is God tells us how life works, right? What to expect out of life. But you also learn that in history of humanity, how often and how hard it is to get people to focus on that. And we could personally speak to that. We could relate.
God created man. And we talk about that. He breathed in the man's nostrils the best of life, and man became a living soul. So life for every man that's ever lived or breathed can be up.
Right.
And it's just as quick going out as it is coming in. I guess my point is, those that die peacefully, that sudden death puts you at peace. It's not to be dreaded, it's to be desired.
Sure, and it takes faith to believe that, doesn't it, Brother Silver?
It's intended to be that.
That's right. So, I mean, to have a peace that passeth all understanding, Philippians 4:6 and following, you can appreciate all the more the goodness of God for the opportunity that lies before us is when we pass from this world. Because of the blood of Christ, we are saved from sin and have that hope. It is called a hope for a reason.
It's the only way
Right.
to be faithful, regardless of the consequences of serving God.
Right.
And this death relieves us of that.
Right. And so that is so important. And getting people to focus on that is not easy. Personally, I can understand. I can speak to that. It's easy. Well, he did.
He paid the price for all sin, man. It's mind-boggling.
There's the more I age, the weight of what Jesus did is greatly appreciated more and more. And I am just amazed, as the song says, about Jesus the Nazarene, of what he did. I can't comprehend it, but I believe it, and it's just amazing what he was able to overcome. Of course, that's Hebrews 12, right? As we're going to see, verse 2. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. Once again, telling these people to endure what they were going through. Looking at these examples of those who were faithful. And not only that, it says, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. A better resurrection. The word better in the book of Hebrews is a word that's used over and over again. It's a better covenant, and here a better resurrection. The idea that was taught that there was going to be a resurrection was taught in the Old Testament. And as a resurrection, as you and I are just, it takes a person who is spiritually minded to think about that resurrection. That it is a reality, not a figment of somebody's imagination. And it's going to happen as soon as you and I are just standing here or sitting here. That's the truth. And it takes faith, as we've talked about, substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. No one's seen the resurrection here, but we believe it because God says it, and we put our trust in Him.
It was another little piece that has always fascinated me. Again, go back to 1 Corinthians and 1 Thessalonians. The dead in Christ shall rise first, and then those that remain shall come. So the priority that God put on those that die is a little higher. Even though it's not respect for persons.
Right.
Those that are at peace that have died, they're taken care of. But while those that like you and me right now, Jesus was to come again,
Right, we'd be translating.
So there's those that suffer, those pieces of
For sure. Yeah, because they were concerned about what happens to those who die before Christ returns, and that was answered there, wasn't it? So, yes, sir. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourging, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned. Reminds me of Naboth's vineyard. Naboth's vineyard, he was stoned because he would refuse to give up the land that Ahab wanted because of his vineyard. Well, he got stoned as a result because of Jezebel's. I mean, you're talking about pragmatism. I mean, that's how you get it done. You know, take the king's stamp, just do it yourself. Aren't you the king? Abuse of power is all in the Bible. It happens. But yet, God is not mocked, is he? Galatians 6, 7, and 8. We know what happened to Jezebel. And we know what happens to anyone who wars against God. And so, as a result of it, he was stoned. Were sawn asunder. So someone was cut in half because of his faith. Now, it has been, according to tradition, said that of Isaiah. You would have church historians, and I'm not talking about modern day, that would say that that's what happened. There's no evidence writing about that. Could have. But it happened because God says so right here. Imagine enduring and having enough faith, strong enough, that you would be willing to be cut in half because you're standing for what's right. There's nothing for us to be ashamed of, right? Isn't that what 1 Peter 4 says?
Amen.
It's very comforting.
What's so unique about the verse? Specifically, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power, it is the source of strength and growth, and it's the way we plug in as we would charge our cell phones, or we eat a meal that would charge our bodies to serve God better. You know, I find it I've always been the type of person, when I would say something, I close the statement with an exclamation point. Now, when I was a young lad, it always had a question mark. And the only thing that concerned me was the why. You give me the purpose or the goal. I know how to go about doing it because I've had others show me how. I know what to do because I've been taught. But you give me the why. It's all I can see with.
And one of the things, Brother Tony, is that God is encouraging people is to stay the course consistently every day, all the time. And that's what has to happen. It's easy to throw in the towel.
What I've learned in life, kind of like the book of Ecclesiastes, is through the application of my faith, no matter how much knowledge I've gained in that subject, there were certain steps I went about doing it. One step at a time, one breath at a time, one thought at a time, one prayer at a time, one request at a time. And then when I went on to a higher faith, it's the same process, same way of going about it. And then when you get reflective, when you learn those bumps and you turn to God for the source and the power, you remember those bumps, but you don't feel them anymore. And the higher you get, the closer you get with God in your faith and strong, for many years, it's just smooth. Waters are calm. It's just like walking on the water to Jesus, you know.
Sure. And it's a building thing. I guess if you don't get the small things right, you're not going to get the big things either.
How do you move a mountain? Rocks. One rock at a time.
Yeah. That's right. That's exactly right. So they were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. And so those in the first century, which we don't have to deal with now, other than COVID-19, right? Which we don't have to deal with now, brethren, but the pattern of life, as we see in history, we read about God's word, there's nothing new under the sun, it's on its way. And this is meant to give us the encouragement and hope. God's people were not conquered, and they will not be conquered today.
What I used to do as a kid when I was young, I looked at my mom and dad, and I tried to be like them. Not the person that made me to be, but I tried to reflect, follow. I was a student. I was following their paths. But when I would read about Abraham, I'm like, wow, I don't know if I could do that. I put him at a higher level. Read about Paul, I'm like, wow, and Peter. And then I realized when I started reading the Bible, when I had gone through error and trials and temptations, and I had faltered or stumbled. They did too.
Yes, they did.
Especially David.
That's right.
But yet they were still written in the book as an example. So that told me, even though I may falter, I can still get back in God's grace.
Absolutely.
By serving Him.
Absolutely, sure can.